The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Apache Junction, Arizona, but Gwendolyn Vaughn barely flinched as she continued to scrub the laundry against the washboard, her knuckles raw and bleeding. It was the spring of 1885, and the sound of gunfire was as common as the howling of coyotes at night. The difference was that this particular shot had been fired by her husband, Theodore Vaughn, who was most likely shooting at empty bottles again in a drunken stupor. Gwendolyn, or Gwen as most folks called her, had been married to Theodore for nearly 7 years, and each day seemed to bring fresh hell. She was 25 now, her once bright green eyes dulled by years of verbal abuse and occasional physical threats. The scar above her left eyebrow was a constant reminder of the time Theodore had thrown a whiskey bottle at her head when she dared to question where he'd been all night. "Gwen, where's my damn dinner?" Theodore's voice boomed from inside their small wooden house at the edge of town. She sighed, wringing out a shirt before hanging it on the line. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly and sweat trickled down her back, soaking through her faded blue dress. "Coming, Theo," she called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Inside, Theodore sat at the table, his dirty boots propped up on the worn wood. He was a large man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. His reputation as a mean drunk was well earned, and most folks in Apache Junction gave him a wide berth. "What were you doing out there, daydreaming again?" He sneered as Gwen entered the house. "Always wasting time, just like your worthless mother." Gwen bit her tongue and moved to the stove where a pot of stew had been simmering. Her mother had died when Gwen was 16, and Theodore never missed an opportunity to speak ill of her. "The stew's ready," she said quietly, ladling a generous portion into a bowl. Theodore grunted and snatched the bowl from her hands, some of the hot liquid splashing onto her fingers. She didn't wince, knowing any sign of pain would only please him. "The Wilsons are having a social gathering tonight," Gwen ventured carefully as she served herself a much smaller portion. "I thought perhaps we might—" "You thought," Theodore interrupted with a harsh laugh. "That's your problem right there. You ain't good for thinking, woman. You're good for cooking, cleaning, and warming my bed. That's it." Gwen stared at her stew, her appetite gone. She'd long since given up on fighting back. It only made things worse. After dinner, Theodore grabbed his hat. "I'm heading to the saloon, don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, and Gwen released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. These moments alone were precious, though they were becoming fewer as Theodore grew increasingly possessive and suspicious. She cleared the table and washed the dishes, then sat by the window with her mother's old copy of Pride and Prejudice, the pages worn thin from countless readings. It was one of the few possessions Theodore hadn't sold for whiskey money. As darkness fell over Apache Junction, Gwen heard the distant sound of horses approaching. This was unusual for their isolated location. She peered out the window and saw a small group of riders in the moonlight. One of them dismounted and approached the house. The knock on the door startled her. Theodore never knocked, and they rarely had visitors. "Mrs. Vaughn," a deep voice called. "It's Sheriff Miller. I need to speak with you." With trembling hands, Gwen opened the door. Sheriff Miller stood on her porch, hat in hand, his weathered face solemn. "Evening, madam." "I'm afraid I have some news about your husband." Gwen's heart raced. "Is he in jail again?" The sheriff shook his head. "No, madam. There was a fight at the Dusty Rose Saloon. Your husband pulled a knife on Xavier Nash." Gwen knew of Xavier Nash. Most people in Apache Junction did. He was a cowboy who'd arrived in town about a year ago, taking work at the nearby Crawford Ranch. He kept to himself mostly, but she'd seen him around town and had heard he was fair and hardworking. "Theodore's dead, Mrs. Vaughn," Sheriff Miller continued. "Mr. Nash acted in self-defense. There were a dozen witnesses who saw your husband attack him unprovoked." The words hit Gwen like a physical blow. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself, unsure if what she felt was grief, relief, or simply shock. "I understand this is difficult news," the sheriff said. "The undertaker will prepare the body. We'll need to discuss arrangements tomorrow." Gwen nodded numbly. "Thank you for coming to tell me, Sheriff." After the sheriff left, Gwen sat alone in the silence of the house. Theodore was gone. The realization slowly sank in. She wouldn't have to walk on eggshells anymore or cover bruises with long sleeves in the summer heat. But what would she do now? Theodore had controlled every aspect of their lives, including their finances. The next morning, Gwen dressed in her best black dress, which wasn't saying much as it was patched in several places. She plaited her long auburn hair and walked into town to meet with the undertaker. As she passed the general store, she heard whispers and saw pitying glances. News traveled fast in a small town like Apache Junction. Some folks likely believed she should be devastated by her husband's death. Others, those who had seen her bruises or heard Theodore's shouting, might understand the complexity of her situation. At the undertaker's, Mr. Peterson explained that there would be a simple burial the following day. "Will you be wanting to say a few words, Mrs. Vaughn?" he asked. I suppose so," she replied, though she couldn't imagine what she might say. As she was leaving, she quite literally bumped into Xavier Nash on the boardwalk. He steadied her with strong, gentle hands, then immediately stepped back, removing his hat. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, his deep voice tinged with regret. "I want to express my condolences." Gwen looked up at him. Xavier Nash was tall, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin. His eyes were a startling blue, contrasting with his dark hair. There was a small cut on his cheekbone, presumably from the altercation with Theodore. "Mr. Nash," she acknowledged. I understand it was self-defense." He nodded solemnly. "Yes, madam. I never intended for things to end that way. Your husband took exception to something I said and came at me with a knife. I truly am sorry for your loss." Gwen wasn't sure how to respond. Should she thank him for killing her abusive husband? Should she maintain the facade of the grieving widow? Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Nash." She moved to walk past him, but he spoke again. "Mrs. Vaughn, if there's anything you need." "Well, I know I'm probably the last person you'd want help from, but the offer stands." Gwen looked at him with surprise. "That's very kind, but I'll manage." That night, as Gwen sat alone in the house that had been her prison for 7 years, the full weight of her situation settled on her shoulders. Theodore had left nothing but debts. The house wasn't even in their name. They rented it from a landowner in Tucson. She had no money, no family, and few marketable skills. The next day, after a sparsely attended funeral where Gwen said only that Theodore lived as he chose, she returned to the empty house and began to take stock of their possessions. There wasn't much worth selling. A few pieces of furniture, Theodore's guns, some tools. A knock at the door interrupted her inventory. It was Mr. Crawford, owner of the ranch where Xavier Nash worked. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, hat in hand, "I've come to discuss your situation." Confused, Gwen invited him in and offered him a seat at the kitchen table. "I'll be direct," Mr. Crawford said. "Your husband owed me money, quite a bit actually. He borrowed to cover gambling debts." Gwen's heart sank. Another debt she couldn't pay. "I don't have much, Mr. Crawford, but whatever I can sell." He held up a hand. "That's not why I'm here. Nash came to me with a proposition. He's offered to work extra shifts to pay off your husband's debt to me." Gwen stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Nash wants to pay Theodore's debt." "Why would he do that?" "He feels responsible for your situation, I suppose," Crawford replied. "Said it wasn't right that a woman should suffer for her husband's mistakes, especially after he trailed off awkwardly. After he killed him," Gwen finished quietly. Crawford nodded uncomfortably. "There's something else. My wife needs help at the main house. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. It would come with room and board in the servants' quarters if you're interested." Gwen couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Your wife needs help just when I need employment." Crawford had the decency to look sheepish. "Nash might have mentioned your situation to her. Martha's been wanting help for a while, but I've been too tight with the purse strings. Nash can be persuasive when he wants to be." 2 days later, Gwen found herself in the small but clean servants' quarters behind the Crawford ranch house. The work was hard, but Mrs. Crawford was fair and considerably kinder than Theodore had ever been. Gwen cooked, cleaned, and helped with the laundry, grateful for the roof over her head and regular meals. She occasionally saw Xavier Nash around the ranch, but he kept his distance, tipping his hat respectfully when their paths crossed. He worked with the cattle and horses, often returning to the bunkhouse covered in dust and sweat. One evening, about 2 weeks after she'd started at the Crawford ranch, Gwen was hanging laundry when she heard a commotion from the corral. She looked over to see several cowboys trying to calm a spooked horse. As she watched, the horse reared, its hooves flailing dangerously close to Xavier, who was attempting to grab its reins. Without thinking, Gwen dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran toward the corral. She slipped between the fence rails and approached slowly, making soft, clicking sounds with her tongue. "Mrs. Vaughn, get back," Xavier called, but Gwen continued forward, her hand extended. "Easy, boy," she murmured to the horse, a beautiful palomino that was rolling its eyes in fear. "Easy now." To everyone's surprise, the horse seemed to respond to her gentle voice. Its breathing slowed and it lowered its head, allowing Gwen to stroke its nose. "Well, I'll be damned," one of the other cowboys muttered. Xavier approached cautiously. "Where'd you learn to do that?" He asked, genuine admiration in his voice. "My father raised horses before he died," Gwen explained, still stroking the palomino's neck. "This one's just scared, not mean." From that day on, something shifted between Gwen and Xavier. He began to stop by the main house more often, sometimes under the pretense of delivering messages to Mr. Crawford. But Gwen noticed he timed his visits for when she might be serving refreshments or tidying the parlor. One Sunday afternoon, Gwen's day off, she was sitting under a cottonwood tree reading her book when Xavier approached, leading 2 saddled horses. "Afternoon, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, his hat in his hand. "I thought you might enjoy a ride. It's a fine day for it." Gwen hesitated. She hadn't been on a horse in years. Theodore had sold her mare early in their marriage. "I don't know, Mr. Nash." "Please call me Xavier," he said, "and I promise the ride will do you good. Thunder here is as gentle as they come." He patted the neck of a chestnut gelding. Against her better judgment, Gwen agreed. Xavier helped her mount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her body, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. They rode across the rolling landscape, Xavier pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area. Gwen found herself laughing at his tales, the sound strange to her own ears. When had she last truly laughed, they stopped by a small creek where wildflowers grew in surprising abundance. Xavier spread a blanket and produced a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and apples from his saddlebag. "This is lovely," Gwen said, accepting a slice of apple, "but I don't understand why you're being so kind to me." Xavier was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes serious as he looked at her. "I killed your husband, Mrs. Vaughn. I can't change that, even if it was self-defense." "Gwen," she said softly. "Please call me Gwen," he nodded. "Gwen, then. The truth is, I knew Theodore before that night at the saloon. I'd seen how he treated you in town, the things he said to you." Gwen looked down, shame washing over her. "You heard that." "I heard enough," Xavier said, his voice gentle. "No woman deserves to be spoken to that way. The night at the saloon, he was bragging about putting you in your place." "I told him a real man doesn't need to belittle his wife to feel strong." Gwen could imagine Theodore's reaction to that, and that's when he pulled the knife, Xavier nodded. "He didn't give me much choice, but I never wanted to make your life harder." "You haven't," Gwen said quietly. "In fact, it's been easier." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the burbling creek and the occasional call of birds. When it was time to return to the ranch, Xavier helped Gwen onto her horse again, but this time his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a pattern. Xavier would find reasons to be near the main house when Gwen was working, and they would exchange brief conversations. On Sundays, they would ride together, exploring the countryside around Apache Junction. Gwen found herself looking forward to these outings and to the sight of Xavier's tall figure approaching across the yard. He was different from any man she'd known. He listened when she spoke, valued her opinions, and never made her feel small or worthless. Mrs. Crawford noticed the budding friendship and pulled Gwen aside one afternoon. "Be careful, girl," she warned kindly. "Nash is a good man, but folks are talking. It hasn't been 3 months since your husband died." Gwen understood the warning. In a small town like Apache Junction, appearances mattered. She was supposed to be in mourning, not riding across the countryside with the man who'd killed her husband. "We're just friends, Mrs. Crawford," Gwen insisted, though she knew her feelings for Xavier had grown beyond friendship. "Maybe so," the older woman replied, But the heart doesn't always follow proper timelines, does it? That Sunday, when Xavier came with the horses, Gwen reluctantly told him they should stop their rides for a while. "People are talking," she explained. "It doesn't look right, me spending time with you so soon after Theodore's death." Xavier's face fell, but he nodded in understanding. "Of course, I didn't think about how it might appear." For several weeks, they maintained a polite distance. Gwen threw herself into her work, taking on extra duties to keep her mind occupied. Xavier worked longer hours with the cattle, often not returning to the ranch until after dark, but fate had other plans for them. One afternoon in late summer, a wildfire broke out in the hills east of the ranch. The Crawford men, including Xavier, rode out to help contain it before it reached the grazing lands, or worse, the town itself. Gwen watched anxiously from the ranch house as smoke billowed in the distance. Mrs. Crawford organized the women to prepare food and bandages, knowing the men would return exhausted and possibly injured. Hours passed with no word. As night fell, Gwen stood on the porch, straining to see through the darkness. Finally, the sound of approaching horses reached her ears. The men were returning, their faces blackened with soot, some with minor burns on their hands and arms. Gwen's eyes searched frantically for Xavier among the riders. When she didn't see him, her heart seemed to stop. "Where's Mr. Nash?" she asked one of the cowboys as he dismounted. "Still out there," the man replied wearily. "He went back for some stranded cattle. Crawford told him to leave him, but Nash is stubborn that way." Gwen's worry turned to fear as more time passed with no sign of Xavier. Mr. Crawford organized a search party, but they returned before dawn with no success. The fire had moved on, leaving blackened earth in its wake, but Xavier Nash seemed to have vanished. For 3 days. Gwen barely slept. She prayed for Xavier's safe return and cursed herself for pushing him away because of town gossip. What did it matter what people thought if he was gone forever? On the 4th day, as Gwen was hanging laundry, she spotted a figure on horseback approaching from the east. The rider was slumped forward, barely staying in the saddle. She dropped the wet sheet and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. It was Xavier. His clothes were torn and singed, his face smudged with soot and blood from a cut on his forehead. His horse, Loyal Thunder, had somehow found the way home. "Xavier," Gwen cried, reaching him just as he slid from the saddle. He looked up at her with bloodshot eyes, his cracked lips forming her name. "Gwen." She helped him into the house and sent for the doctor. Xavier had suffered burns on his arms and back, dehydration and exhaustion, but he would recover. As she bathed his face with cool water, he caught her hand in his. "I thought I might die out there," he said hoarsely. "All I could think about was how I never told you." "Told me what?" Gwen whispered, her heart racing. "That I love you," Xavier said simply. "Have since the first time I saw you in town, even before, everything." Tears filled Gwen's eyes. "I love you too," she admitted, "but people will talk, they'll say terrible things." Xavier struggled to sit up. "Let them talk. I almost died out there, Gwen. Life's too short to care what others think." In the days that followed, as Xavier recovered, they spent hours together. He told her about his life before Apache Junction, how he'd grown up on a small farm in Texas, lost his parents to fever when he was 19, and spent years drifting from ranch to ranch. Gwen shared her own story, her happy childhood cut short by her father's death, her mother's struggle to keep them afloat, and how Theodore had seemed like security at first. "He wasn't always cruel," she confessed one evening as they sat on the porch. "When we first married, he could be charming. But then the drinking got worse, and nothing I did was ever good enough." Xavier took her hand. "You know that's not true, right? You're more than enough, Gwen. You're everything." One night, as they walked under the stars after Xavier had regained his strength, Gwen found the courage to tell him about her darkest moments with Theodore. "He called me worthless," she sobbed, the pain of those words still fresh. "Said I couldn't even give him children, so what good was I as a wife?" Xavier stopped walking and turned to face her, his blue eyes intense in the moonlight. "He was wrong about everything," he said fiercely. "Everything, Gwen. You're the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. Any man would be blessed to call you his wife." The sincerity in his voice broke something open inside Gwen. Years of pent-up tears flowed freely as Xavier held her, his strong arms a shelter rather than a cage. As fall approached, they could no longer deny their feelings despite the whispers in town. Xavier asked Mr. Crawford for permission to court Gwen properly, and to his surprise, the rancher gave his blessing. "Life's too short for false propriety," Crawford said, echoing Xavier's own words. "Anyone with eyes can see you two belong together." Their courtship was unconventional by Apache Junction standards. Instead of chaperoned visits in parlors, they rode together across the open range. Instead of polite conversations about the weather, they shared their deepest fears and brightest hopes. And when Xavier proposed on a hillside overlooking the valley, there was no hesitation in Gwen's acceptance. They married in a simple ceremony in late October, with the Crawfords as witnesses. There were some in town who disapproved, who whispered that Gwen had moved on too quickly, or worse, that perhaps she and Xavier had been involved before Theodore's death. But for every gossip, there was someone who had seen Theodore's cruelty and understood Gwen's choice. With money he'd saved, Xavier purchased a small piece of land on the outskirts of Apache Junction. It wasn't much, just 20 acres with a simple cabin, but it was theirs. Together they fixed up the cabin, adding a second room and a proper kitchen. Gwen planted a garden while Xavier built corrals for the horses he planned to raise. Their first Christmas together, Xavier presented Gwen with a beautiful bay mare. "So you'll always be able to ride by my side," he said as she stroked the horse's velvety nose. Gwen's gift to him was news that brought tears to his eyes. She was expecting their first child. "Theodore was wrong about that too," she said softly, as Xavier placed a gentle hand on her still flat abdomen. Their son, James, was born the following summer, a healthy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, often carrying the baby in a sling as he worked around their small ranch. As the years passed, their family grew. A daughter, Sarah, joined them 2 years after James, followed by twin boys, Robert and William, 2 years later. Their little ranch prospered as well. Xavier had a gift with horses, and buyers came from as far as California for his carefully bred stock. Gwen found her own calling as well. Her gentle way with horses and her nurturing spirit made her a natural teacher. She began offering riding lessons to the children of Apache Junction, including girls who traditionally weren't encouraged to ride. Some traditionalists grumbled, but many parents appreciated her patient approach and firm insistence that their daughters were just as capable as their sons. In the spring of 1895, 10 years after Theodore's death, Gwen stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching Xavier teach 7-year-old James how to gentle a young colt. Sarah sat nearby, carefully drawing the scene in a sketchbook, while the 5-year-old twins played with wooden horses their father had carved. Xavier looked up and caught her eye, his smile still able to make her heart skip after all these years. He said something to James and then walked toward her, his stride strong and confident. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Gwen leaned into his touch. "I was thinking about how different my life is now, how happy." Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Do you ever regret it, coming to work at Crawford's, marrying me so soon after Theodore?" "Never," Gwen said firmly, "not for a single moment." He pulled her close and they stood together watching their children, the life they'd built from the ashes of her first marriage. "You know," Xavier said thoughtfully, "in a strange way, I'm almost grateful to Theodore." Gwen looked at him in surprise. "Grateful, why?" "Because his cruelty led you to me," Xavier explained. "If he'd been a good man, you'd still be with him." Gwen considered this. Perhaps we would have found each other anyway. I like to think some people are meant to be together, no matter what obstacles stand in their way." Xavier smiled and kissed her forehead. "I believe you're right, Mrs. Nash. Some things are simply meant to be." That night, as they lay in bed together, Gwen reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a terrified, belittled wife to a confident, loved woman with a thriving family. The pain of her past hadn't disappeared entirely. There were still nights when she woke in a cold sweat from nightmares of Theodore's rage, but those moments grew fewer with each passing year. What remained constant was Xavier's unwavering support, his gentle reminders whenever she doubted herself that she was worthy, capable, and deeply loved. The man who had once told her that Theodore was wrong about everything had spent a decade proving it, day by day. As Xavier's breathing deepened in sleep beside her, Gwen whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for love found in unlikely circumstances, and for the courage to believe she deserved happiness after years of being told she was worthless. In the wild expanses of Arizona territory, where life was often harsh and unforgiving, Gwen and Xavier Nash had created something rare and precious, a home built on mutual respect, unwavering support, and a love that had flourished against all odds. And that, Gwen knew as she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, was worth everything they'd endured to find it.